Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. We're so pleased to be able to bring you this very special program with Katarzyna Witek and the stories of the Polish World War II survivors in Minnesota. If I want to thank those of you who are friends of ours and supporters. If you're not a friend or supporter or member, we have some great benefits. So please check out our website, which is on the slide on the screen, www.rchs.com, for more information about membership and upcoming programs. RCHS and our partners, the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library, are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And we're so pleased to bring you tonight's program, which is part of our Making Minnesota series. This series explores the untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and Indigenous communities that make up Ramsey County, which is the most diverse county in Minnesota, as well as some of the stories that extend throughout Minnesota and throughout our region. So coming up, we will have part 2 of An Interrupted Childhood on April 6th. And again, that will be on Zoom. And then on March 23rd, we'll be having Dr. William Green and the story of the 1970 teachers strike. So his book will be coming out in the fall, but he's going to do a presentation on that very important strike, which was illegal at the time. But we're also looking forward to that, as well as part 2 of An Interrupted Childhood. So as a reminder, just keep your microphones and cameras turned off for now. And as we get to the end of the program, we'll be able to share. Ramsey County Historical Society has a statement that acknowledges the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Mekoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous people. And you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's www.rchs.com, as well as upcoming and past events about the indigenous peoples of Minnesota. And we pledge to continue to honor the Dakota and the other indigenous peoples of Minnesota, Mekoche. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Katarzyna Witek. Thank you, Katarzyna.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction and having me tonight. I am privileged to be able to tell you the story about Polish post-World War II immigrants. But what I'm going to do today, I'm going to present only part of our project, which, because when I introduced the whole exhibition to the audience on one occasion, it took over an hour and a half, so it was really long. Without much ado, I would like to invite you all, if you can, to the opening of the exhibition of this particular exhibition I'm going to talk about, this project. We have an opening at the Landmark Center on Sunday between 2 to 4 p.m. And Adam Hangurski, who was unable to join us tonight, is going to play violin. He is a renowned violinist who retired a few years ago. He used to be a concertmaster at Minnesota Orchestra and many orchestras around the world, and he came out of retirement just to play the concert for us on Sunday. So if the concert is free, please join us in the auditorium, the main cortile, between 2 to 4 p.m. when the exhibition opens. So this evening I would like, so what I'm going to do is I will share my screen. I hope it works. And we'll talk about the project. So what I am presenting you is a project called Kalejdoskop Polski, Minnesota. When we started working on the project, we decided to keep the Polish spelling of kaleidoscope, which you can see on the screen, because it gives a little bit of more of an interest to the project, and the name is very similar. And what we're trying to do in the project, we're trying to connect the visual art with narratives. And in my presentation today, what I will do is I will present talk a little bit about the organization, then I'm going to talk about the project, and then we'll go about Polish history, because it is very difficult to understand these photos and the whole exhibition without understanding, having Polish history background. And I am not a historian, so it turns out that history is my hobby, but I am not a historian. So if I make any mistakes, I hope I don't. Please forgive me. So let's start with the project. After months of preparations, actually, we started talking about this project in 2019. We set up an oral history project combined with a visual documentary. And our choice of kaleidoscope or Kalejdoskop reflects the fact that Polish Americans living in Minnesota today have a very interesting and multifaceted story. And this story has been missing from the public discourse in Minnesota. When we checked Minnesota historical oral history archives, we found that there were only 4 oral histories recorded of Polish Americans in the archive right now. Due to our work, which we started in 2020, thanks to the grant support from Minnesota Minnesota Historical Societies, Minnesota State's Art Board, Metro Regional Arts Council, we have been able to work to get going and continue. We received continued support. A little bit about myself. So I am Polish. I am originally from Wrocław. It's not Warsaw. Wrocław is a big city in the southwest part of Poland. I am first generation Polish American, and I have been living in Minnesota since mid-1990s. And I am the president of Minnesota Polish Medical Society. And I'm also a practicing physician. So in 2020, we contracted a documentary photographer from Poland to do the visual part of the project in the spring of 2020. I took the roles of project designer, manager. I interviewed and collected the oral narratives, and I coordinated transcription translation work, and I am the exhibits curator. So our organization has been registered with the state of Minnesota since 2019. That's when we received our nonprofit status. And as I said before, the Kalejdoskop received this grant support from Minnesota Historical Society, Minnesota State's Art Board, Metro Regional Arts Council. We also partnered with the Landmark Center, Schubert Club, East Side Freedom Library, Kowalski's Market, and Roseville Library. So the goal of the project is that we want to present the contemporary Polish Americans beyond the well-known stereotypes. Polish people are known in America for pierogi, but Polish and Polish American life and culture is much more diverse than that. We do hope that this project will present Polish Americans in Minnesota outside of festivals and folk customs as involved in daily activities and along with other Americans. Once we embarked on the project, when I started the work, at first I intended this to be just one phase project, but it quickly realized that each of the groups had different needs, different stories, and we needed to divide the project in smaller groups. We have completed 2 phases of the project. We have right now, so we completed the histories. We collected the history of Polish Second World War survivors who live in Minnesota, and political refugees that arrived to state of Minnesota following the imprisonment in Poland, and they were Solidarity freedom fighters in the 80s, and they came here as political refugees. Our next phase of the project, we're going to embark on documenting stories of people who have come to Minnesota from behind the Iron Curtain. So that would be the people that came here in the 60s and in the late 70s. So, as I said before, the project has been conducted in small but more focused groups to highlight the diversity of Polish people. We want to showcase the presence and the diversity of Polish Polish Americans in Minnesota. Minnesota is not very well known beyond the United States. Commonly, Chicago and New York City are considered Polish centers in the US, and other locations are in their shadows. And we want to demonstrate and document presence of Polish Americans in Minnesota to the public in Minnesota, in the United States, and in Poland. We'll consider the success of this project if Polish Americans feel included in Minnesota's history of immigrations, and that people observe a powerful sense of empathy in witnessing the stories. What drives this project is that it's a thoughtful and reflective desire to share how Poles are overcoming obstacles in a way that may prove inspiration for others. Why did we choose photography? That is a question that has been asked for me several times. As Dorothea Lange, a famous American photographer, said, a camera is a tool for teaching how to see without a camera. When we talk about history, it's easy to talk about sweeping numbers across, and troops across vast lands in either directions, but it tends to, when you think about large numbers, it doesn't really tell you much about a person and how the history affected an individual. History of large numbers, tends to be dry and abstract. We chose to take pictures of, documentary photos of people who have lived through the major historical events for them to represent the stories of Polish people during the Second World War. When we started the project, we went about selecting the individuals, which we tried to represent main threads of Polish history. So we tried to present people who have been slave laborers in the German Reich, people who have been sent to gulags, people who lived in Poland, people who went through Russia and joined a so-called Anders army. So we have a variety of different threads that in a capsule tells the various stories of that Polish people experienced during the Second World War, but by no means this is an accurate and complete history of Poland during the Second World War and its aftermath. The individuals we are presenting in our exhibits we are using them as icons to illustrate a problem at a greater level than individuals, and they are representative of the particular thread of a history. The Kalejdoskop project is a visual storytelling project. So we are attempting to connect historical effects and events with narratives to document how these events played on a human scale in an attempt to describe the frame of reference. We collected a small and unique stories that make sense only when connected to a larger narrative. When we went about the project, we verified the individual stories as much as we can. So we were collecting personal items, documents. We verified various websites where individuals were actually recorded as participants of a particular event or document their presence or participation in a particular particular, how to say it, particular story was, we verified that they were saying what they were saying, as much what happened to them as much as we could. The goal was to bring to life the complicated layers of meanings in a communal and personal narratives, and to use documentary photography to share the narratives with the broader community. We collected the interviews, the eyewitness interviews for historical reconstruction and recovery, to go beyond the conventional historical sources and uncover a largely hidden story of this group that has been missing from mainstream accounts. It was very sobering when I was meeting with these people, and these were seniors. They were telling me that I was the first person to ask about their story. But there are many lessons that can be learned from their past. So with interviews, we did audio and video recordings. During our exhibitions, we mostly present only the photographs. We transcribed and translated the interviews. The individual narratives help people make sense of their personal experience for themselves and within the larger historical context. The acknowledgement that people have always faced adversity can help us address some of the challenges we face right now. The stories of the ways that others survived war and deprivation convey the idea that we have collective strengths to overcome new challenges. And why is it important to talk about history? History is not about the parade of great men or the motion of large-scale forces, as I spoke before. History is a human process of social and political change that can only develop through individual action and interactions and decisions. The ability of each individual to see themselves as part of particular society or culture, but also capable of acting to change it. We all have power to make history, and we are making history right now because we are participating in this webinar, trying to learn from our past and more about Minnesota. So without much ado, let's move to talk about a little bit about the exhibition. So we named the exhibition in An Interrupted Childhood, Polish World War II Survivors in Minnesota. The people whose pictures you are about to see were all children during the Second World War. And the exhibition, it's a photographic tribute to Polish immigrants that settled in Minnesota post-World War II. Poland has witnessed many invasions over the years. Armies have seized it for themselves or swept through it on the way to fight other powers. This partly came from being surrounded by belligerent neighbors. Poland was very much affected by the First World War. It's worth remembering that Poland did not exist as an independent state before the First World War. So what happened during the First World War, Poland's geographical position between the two fighting powers meant that much of the fighting and terrific human and material losses occurred in Poland on the Polish lands between 1914 and 1918. Poland was partitioned. The Polish partition occurred between 1772 and 1792, and the powers that divided Poland ceased to exist in 1918. You have a little bit of to understand Polish history. It's important to remember the Polish maps because a lot of people get confused, even if they are trying to track their ancestors' stories, or when they are looking at our descriptions of our little bios that accompany our photos. People get very confused because we write that somebody was born in a town, but this town is now in a different country. So, going back to the First World War, after Russia defected from the Allied coalition, if this gave free rein for the cause of Woodrow Wilson, the American president, to transform the war into a crusade and to spread democracy and liberate Polish people and other people in Central Europe. He introduced 13 points, which were adopted and helped to resurrect Poland in 1918. Poland was reborn as an independent nation in 1918 after World War I and the collapse of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany, which were the main powers that were part of that partitioned Poland earlier. Polish borders were partially reestablished by the Versailles Treaty in 1918. So this is what Poland looked like between World War I and World War II. In August of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty. 1 week later, Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. The first attack took place on September 1st as German aircraft bombarded Polish town of Wieluń. It's a small town. It's not meaningful in terms of any military gains. About over 1,000 people were killed. 5 minutes later, German battleship opened fire on a transit depot in the free city of Danzig. Within days, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany and began mobilizing their army and preparing civilians. France and United Kingdom declared war on Germany on September 3rd. On September 17th, Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. On September 28th, the Soviets and Germans signed Brest Agreement and established a common border. As you can see, Poland was not existing anymore. And on October 10th, Adolf Hitler announced that the war was victorious. And on October 30th, Stalin announced the official annexation of Polish territories. Much mythology surrounds Polish use of cavalry, mostly due to Nazi propaganda absorbed by Western historians. Only about 10% of Polish army was horse cavalry, a much smaller percentage than the US Army in 1939. And Poland actually had more tanks than Italy, which was a country with a well-developed automotive industry at that point. The whole campaign, Polish campaign, lasted about a month. Polish forces surrendered in early October and lost over 60,000 troops and many of thousands civilians. So the occupation began, and the both German and Soviet occupation began with murder and brutality. Many prisoners of war were executed on the spot or later during the war. Countless civilians were also shot or sent to concentration camps, including political leaders, clergy, Boy Scouts, professors, teachers, government officials, doctors, professional athletes. There was this group was part of a special pacification action, or Operation AB, which was a special German campaign during the Second World War aimed to eliminate the intellectuals and upper classes of Polish nation. In the German sector, Jewish were singled out for special brutality. The brutal extermination of Jews proved that people could be killed on unprecedented scale with impunity and in keeping with binding German law. All across Poland, people were trying to survive. While the war lasted, Germany needed labor. Nazi officials imposed labor obligation upon able-bodied Polish people that came to include children as young as 12. The German authorities dictated where and how Poles were employed and could conscript Poles to perform labor in German Reich. Police grabbed people off streets and trains, from marketplaces and churches, and in raids on villages and neighborhoods to fill labor quotas. Between 1939 and 1945, at least over 1.5 million Polish citizens were deported to Germany for forced labor. By 1944, there were over 7.5 million of foreign workers in Germany. So Germans were using slave labor throughout Nazi Germany, and it took place on an unprecedented scale. It was a vital part of German economic exploitation of conquered territories. It also contributed to the mass exterminations of populations in occupied Europe. In regards to Polish people, there were strict Polish decrees. They could not use conveniences such as public transport, visit public spaces or businesses. They could not, for instance, visit German church services. They could not use swimming pools or restaurants. They had to work long hours. They were assigned small food rations, and they were subjects to a curfew. Poles routinely had to work 7 days a week. They could not enter marriage between themselves without a permit. They could not possess money or any objects of value, including bicycles, cameras, or even lighters. They were required to wear a sign on their clothing. We have a picture of this sign. Many workers died as a result of the living conditions. The extreme maltreatment, severe malnutrition, tortures were the main causes of death. And here is Magdalena Świderski. She was born in Krakow in 1925. During the Second World War, Magdalena was returning from school. She was 16, and she was arrested in a street roundup on a home from school. She was 16 when she was sent to Germany as a forced laborer. What Magdalena said what happened is that she still had her colored pencils and her school books in her backpack. So she was put in a locked car. She was particularly distraught because even to use a restroom, you had to ask for permission. And she said that she had did it with tears. When she arrived to Germany, people asked her what she could do. She was a school student, so she didn't really have much skills. So she said she could draw. She said that there were some people who could speak Polish at those tables. So they sent her to work first in the restaurant and in a bakery. She was talked about the mistreatment, about her being hit, about her starving, being afraid all the time for her life. After the war in 1945, she met again Eugeniusz or Eugen Świderski. He was a Polish officer who spent 5 years in a POW camp in Germany, and they married right after the war and lived in France. In the 50s, the family immigrated to the United States, Minnesota. They didn't know anybody in Minnesota when they arrived. Eugeniusz knew some people who lived in Minnesota from his POW camp, and who recommended that they came to Minnesota. So they simply came with just a suitcase and tried to do the best to make the living here. They were icons of Polish community here. Magdalena taught Polish folk art and Christmas decoration making at the International Institute for many years. So while the occupation, this was a little bit about the German occupation. The Soviets occupied more than 50% of Polish territory, and there lived about 13 million Polish people. The rest of the country was occupied by the Germans. The people who were living in the Soviet occupation zone, they were declared Soviet citizens. Men of military age were conscripted into the Red Army. life and for the Poles in the Soviet Union was appalling. As soon as the occupation started, or even before, the Soviets started to work on classifying the people living in the occupied territory. They categorized people by age, ethnicity, religion, occupation, and home ownership. Soon after the occupation started, they started deportations from the eastern part of Poland, from the eastern part of Poland, which was then occupied by the Soviet Russia, and those people were deported into the depths of the Soviet Union. The first victims of deportations, which started in 1939, were Polish officers. There is a history which is still, I believe, disputed between Poland and Russia about the murder of over 200,000 of Polish soldiers that were taken prisoner in September and October of 1939. The Soviet security services murdered majority of Polish officers, POWs, in April and May of 1940 during so-called Katyn massacre and many other places across Soviet Union. The second group of Polish deportees were Poles who used to live in German occupied zone and fled to the Soviet zone. Many of them were Jewish. The third category was Poles who, according to the Soviets, were the work class enemies. And these ranged from pre-war employees of pre-war Poland that included police officers, teachers, judges, prosecutors, railway workers, politicians, social activists, aristocrats, owners of private companies, lawyers, architects, managers, bankers, medical and veterinary doctors. People were taken from their homes in the dead of the night. That seems to be a pattern that the Soviet security services, Soviet secret services developed even during the early 1900s. People were crammed into cattle carts. You have a picture of the cattle carts, and there might be up to 80 people crammed into this wagon. And after a journey of many weeks, if they survived, they were placed in the work camps in Siberia or dumped in steppe of Kazakhstan. During the transport, while living in gulags or in Kazakhstan, starvation was common and the mortality rate was very hard. During the transport, each train carried corpses to the next town in a separate open cart. The carts were locked. It is estimated that between 1939 and June of 1941, as many as over a million of Polish people were deported, although some historians project much higher numbers. The deported were used as cheap labor force that performed grueling labor from mining, building canals and railroads, logging, floating timber, working in kolkhozes and factories, and about only a third of those people survived. But eventually, Polish people began to be released from imprisonment. What happened is that on June 22nd in 1941, Nazi Germany was attacked Soviet Union, and suddenly Soviet Union needed all the help they could get. So in 1941, Great Britain and the Soviet Union agreed to cooperate in the fight against Nazi Germany. Polish government in exile in London and the Soviet Union came to an agreement that the Soviets would release their Polish prisoners from the camps, so a Polish army could be formed in Soviet Russia to fight the Nazis. The Polish army was to be commanded by General Anders, who was set free by the Soviet secret police. As the Poles began to be released from their imprisonment, they faced a daunting task of finding the Polish army across the vast distances of Soviet Union. One of the Polish presidents of the government in exile reported that when he arrived into the northern Siberia in mid-1940s with a group of over 300 deportees, after a year of his deportation, only 18 of these people survived. The men who reported to the Anders army for duty were gaunt, exhausted, life-ridden, and malnourished individuals who were dressed in rags. And here is Walter. He was a teenager when he and his family was rounded up at night and deported into in the depths of Soviet Russia. He was born in Burdykowszczyzna, Poland. Now that village is in Belarus. He was arrested on December 6th, 1926. In September, in September, when the Soviet Red Army invaded Eastern Poland, this was part of, as I said, part of this brutal occupation. So his family was sent to a Soviet work camp near Arkhangelsk in the Arctic Circle. 2 years later, he and his family were released from the work camp and journeyed from Arkhangelsk to Uzbekistan to join the Polish army under General Anders. Walter was a teenager. He completed military training in the Young Soldiers Cadet School in Egypt and participated in the legendary Monte Cassino battle in Italy in 1944. He was in reconnaissance. He was about 17. He was driving a reconnaissance vehicle. After the war, he lived in Great Britain and then emigrated to Minnesota in 1961. Again, he didn't know, he had no relatives in Minnesota. It was the connections with people he's made during the war. Some people already moved to Minnesota, and that's how he came to Minnesota. Again, locally, the Polish community were his support here, and his friends from the army. Eventually, he comes from a large family, so eventually some of his relatives moved to Minnesota as well. I mentioned the history of Jewish people in the beginning in Minnesota. I'm sorry, in Poland. So Holocaust in part was part of the European-wide effort organized by Nazi Germany and took place in German-occupied Poland. The Holocaust in Poland was marked by the construction of death camps by Nazi Germany, German use of gas vans, mass shootings by German troops and their auxiliaries. The extermination camps played a central role in the extermination of both Polish Jews and Jews whom Germans transported to their deaths from Western and Southern Europe. Every branch of the sophisticated German bureaucracy was involved in the killing process, from the interior and finance ministers to German firms and state-run railroads. The deportations to death camps began to spring in about 1942. But the use of gas vans started in about 1941. The orders of the occupation authorities, and in particular the ordinance of the Nazi German governor Hans Frank from October 15 of 1941, provided for the death penalty for every Pole who would provide shelter for a Jew or help him in any other way. at the beginning of the occupation, the Germans carried out arrests, executed inmates in prisons, conducted public executions. Many Jews from the ghettos were not transported to the death camps, but were killed on the spot in ditches outside of city and at the edge of the forests. By October of 1942, Germans killed approximately 97% of Polish local Jews. The principle of collective responsibility applied by the Germans to the families of those who helped Jews, and sometimes entire communities, were subjects of retribution. Here is Adam, who presents a medal of Righteous Among the Nations, an organization that honored, that recognized over 6,000 Polish rescuers. During this genocide, about 3 million Polish Jews were murdered, and half of all Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. A Jewish person had about 1.5% of survival, and only about 350,000 Polish Jews survived the World War. Majority of them, about 230, survived in the Soviet territories and Soviet Russia. And that included the men and the women who escaped from areas occupied by the Germany. So what happened with Adam? Adam was a child when the war broke out. His mother was pregnant with him. And the family, Adam's parents lived in Krakow. When the war broke out, his parents decided to travel east to Lviv, where some of his grandparents lived, and that's where Adam was born. He was born in Lviv. A lot of Polish people thought that moving eastward was going to help them, but most people didn't know that, didn't expect that Soviet Russia was going to attack Poland. So as the war progressed, Adam lived in near Lviv in Yavorov. Lviv is now in Ukraine. His mother at the time was a musician. She was a pianist, and she was on a tour in Russia, and he was living with his paternal grandparents and his father. Eventually, what happened is that his family was placed in ghetto in Yavorov. And his Polish nanny came to a rescue when they were liquidating the ghetto, and he was moved to a ghetto in Krakow to live with his maternal grandparents. A majority of his family perished in Holocaust. Miraculously, his parents survived, although each of them survived separately. So his mother was in Russia on a tour with Ukrainian folk and dance ensemble. His father actually worked for got Aryan papers, and he assumed the name of Tadeusz Górski. And he was able to actually join German forces organization TOD. Eventually, he was arrested as a German spy, and then he was placed in Russian Gulag. His paternal grandmother and aunt and one of his cousins survived in a farm. They were saved by a farmer who dug a hole in a barn, and they were living in the hall at night. covered by a rabbit cage. Adam, as I said, was transported by Katarzyna to Krakow to his maternal grandparents. And when they were liquidating ghetto, Adam was smuggled out by Katarzyna, and then he spent the rest of the war with her. Adam's grandparents perished. So because Adam was very little, the only parents he knew was his Polish nanny and her husband. And Adam told me that to this day, he thinks every day about these people who risked their lives for him 24/7, because if they were found out that they were hiding a Jewish child, not only them would be killed, but all their whole family. And Jan had 2 adult daughters. So at the age of 5, Adam reunited with his parents who survived the Holocaust. After the war, the family was relocated from Lviv, which then became a Soviet Union, and his family moved to Upper Silesia in Poland. Adam emigrated to Israel in the 50s, where Adam started his music education in Poland. His first public concert occurred when he was 7 years old in Poland, Katowice. And then he continued his music education in Israel, and then eventually he ended up in LA. He is a student of Jascha Heifetz, a famous violinist. And Adam became a virtuoso violinist and a concertmaster who performed with many orchestras around the world, including Minnesota Orchestra. And he lived in many countries, including Israel, Austria, Germany, and the United States. But following his retirement from an orchestra in Vienna, Adam decided to return to Minnesota, of all places. And I think I would like to stop at this point, because I can get going, but there's, we would take a long time.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Okay. We so appreciate your insights and sharing this painful history. If people have questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will, you should be able to unmute your microphones. We are still recording. If there's something sensitive that you'd like to share, we can turn the recording off in a little while. But again, thank you all for being here. And feel free for your questions and comments. So Katarzyna, why don't you talk a little bit about how, while we're waiting for other questions, about how you found the people that you interviewed?
Well, that's a story in itself. So what happened is I went to Poland for on the vacation, and I met with the photographer, and he showed me one of his projects. And then we started talking about perhaps creating a similar project in Minnesota and in the United States. But before we could start, we needed to, as you're saying, we needed to have subjects, people that the people were needed for the story. So I started to talk to my friends and collecting names, and the selection of the people and connecting with the people to interview took about a good 6 months. And it was like, I spoke to one person, and then the person say, oh, you need to speak to this person, and then that person. So, eventually I had a list of about 50 some people that we considered for the project, and then we carefully reviewed the stories, and then we decided to pursue the interviews with with some of the people. For this part of the project, it's worth remembering that some of the individuals' age is quite advanced and was at the time. So that was another consideration. So it took very many months to answer your question, to find the people who were able and willing to talk.
Mary had a question. Is there a Polish social organization where immigrants to Minnesota currently meet?
I'm not aware of it. That's a very good question. I don't think so. I don't think such an organization exists. I think we probably are the first organization that took upon recording Polish immigrant stories in Minnesota on this level in an organized manner, of that I am aware of the current Polish immigrants.
If somebody knows of something, feel free to put it in the chat. I was wondering, as we talked earlier and you presented during your program, it seems like most of the people that you talked to came over on their own. And, you know, immigrants to Minnesota have a variety of experiences. I mean, a number of, for instance, say the Irish immigrants were brought over by the church. Were there any churches or helping hands for people to help them get started, or was everyone pretty much on their own that you've talked to?
So a lot of people that I have spoken to, they had a connection with the International Institute of Minnesota. So for this group, Magdalena, I believe, came that way, but the group of the Solidarity era refugees, they mentioned the International Institute of Minnesota. Unfortunately, a lot of these individuals did not remember how they came to Minnesota. So, you know, because of it was many, many years ago, and some of them were not really able to recall that part of the history. Adam just came off on his own to Minnesota because, I mean, he technically should be in a different group of our immigrants, because he would be the Polish person that came from behind Iron Curtain, and that wouldn't even be the exact description of his journey to Minnesota, because he came to Minnesota as a professional already in the 70s, and he was not escaping from behind Iron Curtain directly, but indirectly. They did not recall, but they were talking about having connections in terms of having friends and friends. This group that I'm talking about. Next time in April, I will be talking about a different group of individuals, about 4 individuals. So 3 out of the 4 people I'm going to talk about next time in April had actually Minnesota connections before the war. It's quite interesting. So this particular group did not have Minnesota connection. It was actually after the Second World War, it was not easy to immigrate to Minnesota or to the United States. That's an interesting piece to it, that the United States were not taking people right away. Most of these people arrived to Minnesota in the 1950s.
And could you share the name of the photographer with us again?
His name is Grzegorz Lityński. He is based in Poland. He works on the project mostly in Europe and in Poland.
Okay, great. So James has a very nice comment, and Crystal was talking about being 3rd generation on paternal side, and we can share that if you would like. Mary has another question. She associates Northeast Minneapolis with a large Polish Catholic community. Is that correct?
Well, you know, so Polish immigration has changed quite a lot. Polish people currently tend to, if they immigrate, they tend to do so in Europe rather than to the United States. So the waves of immigration, it's much smaller. Mostly in the recent years, it's mostly the professionals that moved to the United States for a variety of reasons, or people who have made their families. And people, and Poland is quite a, it's a developed country right now, so people don't have as much of a reason to leave Poland at the moment, and have not had a reason to leave for a long time, since the fall of the communism in 1989. So the demographics completely changed.
So would you remind everybody about the opening, and then maybe talk a little bit, we have we're getting close to time, but if you want to just share a little bit about the future of the project?
So the future of the project, so I can show you all the panels that are on the exhibit. I can share that. So you've seen the opening panel, and we have a panel of Magdalena. This is her with her cutouts and her artwork. She was an artist. This is Leonard. So I will be talking about Leonard next time. This is Walter. I spoke about Walter. And you have a little bit of a pictures. We actually managed to get him into his uniforms. So we talked about Leonard, Walter. This is Anatol. We're going to talk about him next time. It's his picture. This is Maria, his sister. But they have entirely different stories. And this is Victor. We are going to talk about his story next time when we meet. And Adam. So the future we envision recording more oral histories. We are now going to focus on the stories of people who have come to Minnesota from behind the Iron Curtain. And then we are going to be recording stories of people who came to Minnesota, after the fall of communism. And we are going to be collecting some histories of the Polish Americans, second, third generation that live in Minnesota as well.
Great. Yeah, it's very important to save these. I think we all agree with Crystal saying that these are all very important, that they have to be preserved before. Yeah.
We wish that we could interview everybody and all the people's stories. Unfortunately, we don't have the capacity or the manpower to do this. But if anybody would like to get involved with us and help us out in any way, we would appreciate your help. Or if anybody would like to volunteer for our organization as well, we have a little bit of we're a hybrid organization, so we have two kind of ways of activities. We are social contact for Polish professionals and Polish medical professionals, physicians, and we also support art. And with in our meetings, it became clear that we are really interested in supporting education about Poland, art and language and the culture. So this is our mission.
So if anybody would like to help out, feel free to send an email to events, events @rchs.com, and I'll forward that to Katarzyna. And we thank you for any support that you can give to this important project. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Katarzyna, for this wonderful presentation. And again, I want to urge everybody for joining us on April 6th for part 2 of Interrupted Childhood, and then on Sunday remind me of the time for the opening.
It's 2 to 4 p.m. and the meters are free on Sunday.
The meters are free. Well, that's very important to know. And that will be at the Landmark Center in downtown St. Paul on between 5th and 6th Street. Most people, I think, know where that would be. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. These stories are are very, they're difficult. They're not easy stories. But I was really quite impressed with the positivity of these people. I would ask them about, what was the hardest time in the United States? And they would say, there was no hard time. I'm just happy to be alive. Or, what do you think about your life? I had a great life. The survival, the resilience was quite remarkable. Although it's clear that these people have suffered greatly.